Hello and welcome to the View Source interviews today with one and only Elizabeth Sweeny, coming all the way from
Mountain View, California.
Mountain View, California, from a little startup that some of you might have known. It starts with a G, something like Google alphabet. It's very hard to know at this point.
We'll figure it out one of these days.
Yes, and she's working on the Chrome team and she's working on making things faster, right? Am I correct to say
Yep.
that? You like performance, don't you?
I do, particularly given that my portfolio covers things like Lighthouse, web.dev, and Chrome User Experience Report. So yeah,
Yes,
all fast is good.
which are all incredible tools for all of us developers and everybody involved on the web, essentially, to make things faster. I'm going to dive right into the question because I'm a bit too curious at times. When you think about performance, right? At least in the past, we used to think that, all right, so we need to specialize in getting a speed index, proper speed index, or we need to get like proper online time. And at this point, it feels like we need to have a broader variety of metrics to see where we should stand and to kind of understand the bigger picture, the full picture of where we are. So when you kind of look into the metrics and the spectrum of metrics, which ones would you say are always a good mix to keep in mind when optimizing for performance?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I think ultimately I always hesitate to give a specific set of metrics that's kind of like the golden rule, given that depending on what industry you're in, depending on your audience, where they are geographically, and what, their typical hardware setup is, there are a lot of different factors that will go into what is a good mix for you. But as a general rule, there are a few good guidelines that you can always follow to kind of make sure that you are picking a good set that is going to be representative of your user's experience. So I always say start with making sure you have both early and late load covered. So make sure you're picking metrics across the spectrum and not just focusing on something like FCP or TTI. You need to have a good, healthy mix. Then there's also making sure you have interactivity covered. Max potential FID, which I think is still an origin trial right now from a lab perspective. But making sure you know when a user is actually touching your page, are they just getting super pissed? And then the last kind of barometer for whether or not you're picking good mix of metrics is whether or not you have a healthy balance between lab and field, because you really do need to constantly be oscillating between the two and validating whether or not the synthetic testing that you're running is being reflected in what your users are experiencing in the real world. So like I said, the specific mix of metrics is going to be a little bit more specific to kind of who your users are, but a good place to look for a baseline set is Lighthouse. So that's always my go-to. There are 6 metrics there. They do change as we get more insight into how to actually accurately measure user experience. So we just constantly try to keep what Lighthouse measures as close to the user experience as possible. So there are changes there, but that's a good place to start if you don't know where to go.
And it's very interesting to see many companies actually looking into combining those metrics, established metrics, with something custom, like time to first tweet or time to first pin on Pinterest and things
Yes.
like that. And I actually do see many companies really trying to even prioritize those metrics, like kind of the core business metrics, so to say. And then, of course, run audits with Lighthouse and all just to see if they're doing well enough, especially compared to the competitors. But then still there are a couple of things that kind of keep showing up quite a lot, I guess, and especially with the heavy JavaScript that's being pushed everywhere. That's probably the major blocker for many performance optimization, for much of the performance optimization work out there. So how would you recommend companies to start when they want to optimize for performance, knowing that the JavaScript is just too heavy? Because there is this mythical performance profiling in dev tools, and everybody is afraid. Not everybody, but many people are afraid to touch it. So, what would be a good starting point there?
Yeah, no, and I'm gonna be a broken record, and I do apologize for that, but my go-to is always Lighthouse. So the reason being is that per your question, DevTools can be kind of a fire hose of data, and it's a phenomenal fire hose that is just the best thing ever. But it is extremely difficult, particularly if you're new to the game, kind of where you start and how do you actually pull out and triage what to focus on. So being able to, particularly when you run Lighthouse in the DevTools audit panel, because then you can go straight to the trace. So as opposed to other product surfaces where you're able to access Lighthouse, it allows for kind of that marriage of analysis where you can oscillate between kind of a curated insights report to the raw data, and you can dive a little bit deeper into it and see what's actually causing you to fail audits. But it's a great way to kind of prioritize your workflows.
And specifically, what do you see as the main problem that you find in much of the, many web applications or websites out there? What are the major performance bottlenecks that show up quite a lot?
Yeah, so I think what I do see a lot is this. How do I put this? It's a feeling extremely tied to kind of existing feature sets and not wanting to let go of some things that are more heavyweight. So the other kind of side of that is you, for whatever type of page you're shipping, you are shipping all of your goodies, and not being able to really think through, okay, if I'm sending something without an image gallery, do I really need to be sending all of this image gallery support? And it's surprising how many sites actually kind of send everything regardless of what the page is actually presenting. So being able to categorize the types of sites, the types of pages that you have on your site, whether it's by kind of analyzing DOM tree or categorizing in some other fashion, and being able to tailor what you're sending over the line for each type sub page type, is something that's great. But a lot of the decisions that impact performance are made really early on, right? Like depending on how you're kind of tooling yourself and what stack you're using, we see people setting themselves up for performance troubles, and they're kind of fighting an uphill battle based on the decisions that they make early on.
Which brings us, of course, to the question about the ideal performance budgets and how to set up one. So once we have an understanding of the complexity of an application, but we haven't started building it yet, maybe, how would you recommend to start to set up a pretty realistic, I would say, but also good performance budget? And what does it even make? What makes a good performance budget?
Yep. So I have two things to say on that. One is a good performance budget is going to cover resource allocation. It's going to cover kind of metrics and milestones. And then, so those two components are really key. And then you can also set it up for scores, for instance, with Lighthouse if you want. But the two are really, resource, making sure that you're watching that, and then your actual metrics. But the easy way to do it is my fantastic colleague, Katie Hempenius, based in New York office. She created a perf budget calculator. So it gives you a really good sense of, if you want X performance and you want to see your metrics, stay here, this is going to be a realistic performance budget for you. That's going to be a very good baseline, because it's extremely difficult to know, like, is this a good budget? I don't know. So she takes the guesswork out of it for us.
Fantastic. Yeah, I heard that tool. I will tweet it later as well. That's great. Um, there is also a lot of stuff that's happening. I mean, if I look at Lighthouse today, and if I look at like in general perf tooling today and compare it to, let's say, 5 years ago, this has been such an incredible improvement. That's just unbelievable. But sometimes I feel like we don't really know what to do next to improve performance. Like when I see this wonderful, almost magical tools like Guest.js appearing, where
Yeah.
let's assign probability scores to how likely this button is to be clicked, and then preload Webpack chunks based on that. When you think about performance like holistically for the next 2 years or so, we are pretty good at actually identifying the problems these days, kind of giving also pretty good and accurate predictions of what we need to do to improve performance. But looking forward, how will the world of web perf tooling and essentially just improving performance change? Will it be all about probability and machine learning and AI, all spawning and running around our websites trying to make predictions about the modeling of what the user behavior is going to be? Or is it more pragmatic than that?
Yeah. So I always like coming up with, talking to colleagues and seeing the robot sitting at the computer and coming up with the next great thing. However, I do think the reality is slightly more pragmatic. And it is, while we have gotten extremely good at accurately measuring things, there is still so much work that we can be doing about how to actually dissect source problems. So, that root cause analysis is something that there's still kind of a distance there between tooling and kind of the root causes of problems. We're often measuring something that's symptomatic and needing to go back and diagnose ourselves, and that still requires quite a bit of expertise. And so closing that gap between, okay, here's what we're seeing and here's what we're measuring, what the hell actually caused that and how do we fix it? Closing that gap and is I think where we're going to see a lot of the focus over the next few years. And what that actually looks like is just the first step is being able to dissect things much more granularly. So I want to be able to very accurately take out all third-party stuff and then analyze that separately. I want to be able to take my bundle and pull it apart and see which sections are used and have some of the more difficult to use tooling add an insights engine on top of that, so that it's not taking the guesswork out of it for you. So I think that's if I were to put my money on it, that would be where we were going.
So am I correct to assume that we might see some features like that showing up in some tools like maybe Lighthouse at some point soon?
So soon I'm going to specifically not define, but yes, it's definitely things that we're looking into.
Okay. What do you see like if you were looking at the performance picture per se? Like we've been dealing with HTTP2 and HTTP server push had been, a bit mysterious. And I know that you'll be speaking about demystifying speed tooling specifically, but actually looking into protocols, networking level, is HTTP3 going to save the world forever? So we won't have to deal with all the issues we're dealing with today? Or is it still a long battle to fight?
So I will be extremely candid with you and say I have absolutely no idea.
That's fair enough because there's we feel like the technology is going to save us, so we won't have to do much work. But it looks like the more technology is moving forward, the more fragmented it becomes. Like if you look at low-end devices, let's say, which might be on a good connection, but then still the memory concerns and so all arise, right? So, last question for you, and you have to be perfectly honest. So if you
Okay.
look at this interview or watch this interview maybe 2 years later, right? And you think back about, that was interesting. What would you like to see in 2 years in the world of web performance? What would you like to have solved? Or maybe you would like to be in a slightly different place. So maybe have some ideas about that.
That's a great question. I would love to be able to close the gap between lab and field metrics. It would excite me so deeply to be able to not have to both make sure that we are correlating lab metrics as closely as possible to field metrics, because that's obviously always a huge challenge and on some level just not possible. But the closer we get, the better. And then also decreasing the lag time that we get from field, and making sure that feedback loop is very tight. I think that would change how we react to field data in particular.
So I think that we have a little bit of work to do for the next couple of years then. Well,
Yes.
but I'm looking forward to see how it's going to evolve and change over time. With this in mind, I think we're good. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for joining me and for a few insights about the world of performance and also about your session, which is going to be, I'm not sure, 31st of September or 1st of October.
I'm glad somebody knows.
Somewhere in between, I believe. And then I'm looking forward to seeing you as well. Right. With this in mind, thanks for joining me, and thanks everyone for watching, and see you next time.